Have you ever wondered why ancient Egyptian goddesses were depicted with such mesmerizing beauty and powerful feminine energy that their worship lasted for thousands of years? Well, the answer lies in two extraordinary deities who ruled over the most fundamental forces of human existence: love, fertility, and the very essence of life itself. In this video, I'm going to reveal the captivating stories of Isis and Hathor, two goddesses whose seductive powers and fertility magic shaped the destiny of pharaohs, common people, and entire civilizations. These weren't just mythological figures collecting dust in temple corners. They were living, breathing forces that Egyptian women called upon during childbirth, that men prayed to for virility, and that rulers invoked to legitimize their divine right to the throne. What I'm going to show you today will completely transform how you understand ancient Egyptian spirituality. We'll dive deep into the secret rituals, the passionate love stories, and the incredible influence these goddesses wielded over one of history's greatest civilizations. By the end of this series, you'll understand why these two divine women were considered the ultimate sources of feminine power in the ancient world. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how powerful these goddesses really were. Imagine walking through the grand temples of ancient Memphis at sunset, where the air is thick with incense and the sound of sistrum bells echoes off limestone walls. Priestesses draped in fine linen move gracefully between towering columns, their movements precise and purposeful as they prepare for the evening rituals dedicated to Hathor. In another part of the city, at the temple of Isis, a young woman clutches a small amulet to her chest, whispering desperate prayers for the child she carries. These scenes played out daily across Egypt for over 3,000 years. The story begins not with grand mythology, but with a very human moment. Picture Ankhesenamun, the young widow of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, standing alone in her chambers as news of her husband's death spreads through the palace. The year is approximately 1323 BCE, and this 18-year-old woman faces a terrifying reality. Without a male heir or protector, she could lose everything. But Ankhesenamun wasn't just any woman. She was the daughter of the revolutionary pharaoh Akhenaten and the legendary beauty Nefertiti. She knew the power that resided in divine feminine energy. As palace officials debated her fate in distant corridors, Ankhesenamun made her way to her private shrine dedicated to Isis. The goddess stood before her in carved perfection, arms outstretched in protection, the throne hieroglyph crowning her head like a promise of power. This wasn't mere superstition for Ankhesenamun. Isis represented something far more profound than modern minds often grasp. She embodied the principle that feminine power could resurrect the dead, create life from nothing, and transform chaos into order. The young queen began the ritual she had learned from her mother and grandmother before her. She lit sacred oils, arranged offerings of bread and beer, and spoke the ancient words that connected her directly to the divine feminine force that Egyptians believed governed all creation. But this wasn't just about asking for help. This was about channeling the very essence of what made Isis so powerful: her ability to seduce not through mere physical beauty, but through the irresistible force of life-giving magic. You see, when we talk about seduction in the context of these Egyptian goddesses, we're not talking about shallow manipulation or temporary attraction. We're talking about a cosmic force that ancient Egyptians believed was literally responsible for the continuation of existence itself. Isis didn't just seduce her husband Osiris back to life after he was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set. She used her feminine power to gather his scattered pieces, to breathe life back into his body, and to conceive their son Horus through an act of divine love that transcended death itself. This story wasn't just mythology to people like Ankhesenamun. It was a blueprint for female power that could overcome any obstacle, even the ultimate obstacle of death. When Egyptian women faced childbirth, they called upon Isis not just as a fertility goddess, but as the divine mother who had literally created life from death. When they faced rejection or heartbreak, they remembered how Isis had won back her beloved through the sheer force of her devotion and magical knowledge. But Isis shared this cosmic stage with another goddess whose power operated differently, yet complementarily. While Isis represented the devoted wife and protective mother, Hathor embodied the intoxicating joy of feminine sexuality and the life-affirming power of pleasure itself. If Isis was the goddess you prayed to in your darkest hour, Hathor was the goddess you celebrated with in your moments of greatest joy. Picture now a very different scene, but one equally important to understanding these goddesses' true power. In the bustling port city of Dendera, a successful merchant named Kemweset prepares for the most important business negotiation of his life. He spent months arranging a meeting with royal officials who could grant him exclusive trading rights along the Nile. Success would make his family wealthy for generations. Failure would mean financial ruin. But Kemweset doesn't spend the morning before this crucial meeting reviewing his proposals or calculating profit margins. Instead, he makes his way to the magnificent temple of Hathor that dominates the city skyline. This isn't the action of a desperate man grasping at supernatural straws. This is the calculated move of someone who understands that in ancient Egypt, success in worldly affairs was inseparable from divine favor. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera was unlike any other religious site in Egypt. Where most temples were solemn places of worship, Hathor's domain pulsed with music, dancing, and celebration. The goddess was often depicted holding a sistrum, a sacred rattle that produced sounds believed to maintain cosmic harmony. But more than that, Hathor represented the principle that joy itself was a divine force capable of transforming reality. As Kemweset approaches the temple, he hears the sound of women's laughter mixing with the tinkling of bronze sistrums. Priestesses move in flowing dances that mirror the movement of the Nile itself, their movements designed not just to honor the goddess, but to channel her seductive power into the world. This wasn't entertainment. This was magic of the highest order, based on the belief that Hathor's joyous energy could literally reshape the fabric of existence. The merchant makes his offering not with solemn prayers, but with wine and music. He understands something that modern people often miss about ancient Egyptian religion. These goddesses weren't distant, judgmental deities who demanded fearful submission. They were intimate partners in the dance of life, eager to share their power with those who approached them with proper understanding and respect. What made both Isis and Hathor so compelling to ancient Egyptians was that their power wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was practical magic that people could access and use in their daily lives. A woman struggling with infertility didn't just pray to Isis for a child. She performed specific rituals designed to align her own feminine energy with the goddess's creative force. A man seeking to win the affection of a desired partner didn't just ask Hathor for help. He learned to embody the joy and confidence that made the goddess herself irresistible. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian goddess worship: the idea that humans could actually channel divine power through their own bodies and actions. Unlike many religious traditions that emphasize the vast gulf between mortal and divine, Egyptian spirituality taught that the gods and goddesses lived within human beings, waiting to be awakened through proper ritual and understanding. Consider the story of Nefertari, the beloved queen of Ramesses II, whose tomb in the Valley of the Queens remains one of the most beautiful burial sites ever created. Historical records suggest that Nefertari wasn't chosen as queen primarily for political reasons or family connections. Instead, she seems to have been selected because she embodied the qualities of both Isis and Hathor so completely that the pharaoh saw her as their living representative on earth. Nefertari's tomb paintings show her in direct communication with both goddesses, not as a suppliant begging for favor, but as a sister deity participating in cosmic governance. The queen is depicted wearing the horned headdress of Hathor and the throne crown of Isis, suggesting that she had achieved the ultimate goal of Egyptian feminine spirituality, becoming a living goddess herself. This wasn't just royal propaganda or artistic exaggeration. Egyptian queens underwent intensive training in the mysteries of feminine divine power, learning not just how to perform rituals, but how to embody the very essence of goddess energy in their daily lives. They studied the sacred texts that described how Isis had used her knowledge of secret names to gain power even over the sun, god Ra himself. They learned the dance movements that allowed Hathor to seduce and tame the violent god Set when he threatened to destroy all creation. But perhaps most importantly, they learned that the seductive power of these goddesses wasn't based on manipulation or trickery. It was based on their complete mastery of the life force itself. When Isis seduced Osiris back to life, she wasn't using feminine wiles to trick him into resurrection. She was channeling the fundamental creative energy of the universe, the same force that caused the Nile to flood each year, that made crops grow, that ensured the continuation of all life. This understanding transforms everything we think we know about ancient Egyptian attitudes towards sexuality and feminine power. These weren't patriarchal societies that merely tolerated goddess worship as a quaint tradition. They were civilizations built on the recognition that feminine creative energy was literally the foundation of existence itself. The rituals dedicated to Isis and Hathor reflected this cosmic understanding. During the annual festival of Hathor, held when the Nile floods began to recede and planting season approached, Egyptian women would gather in temple courtyards to perform dances that mimicked the movements of creation itself. These weren't modest, restrained movements. They were full-body expressions of joy, sensuality, and life-affirming power that participants believed could actually influence the fertility of the coming harvest. Similarly, the mysteries of Isis, secret initiation rituals that attracted devotees from across the ancient world, taught participants how to access the goddess's power of transformation and renewal. These weren't abstract spiritual exercises. They were practical techniques for channeling divine feminine energy into real-world situations. The evidence of these practical applications can be seen in the story of Amaniadis, a woman whose name appears on papyrus fragments discovered in the workers' village near the Valley of the Kings. Unlike the royal women we've discussed, Amaniadis was a common person, a baker's wife who faced a crisis that would have been familiar to women throughout history. After 3 years of marriage, she had not conceived a child, and in ancient Egypt, this wasn't just a personal disappointment. It threatened her entire social standing and economic security. But Amaniadis didn't resign herself to fate. Instead, she embarked on a journey that reveals exactly how ordinary Egyptians accessed the power of these goddesses. She began by visiting a local priestess of Isis, not in some grand temple, but in a small shrine tucked between residential buildings where working-class women could afford the modest offerings required. The priestess taught Amaniadis a ritual that sounds almost shockingly intimate to modern ears, yet was considered perfectly natural by Egyptian standards. She was instructed to create a small clay figure representing herself and another representing the child she desired. These weren't simple dolls, but carefully crafted representations infused with specific symbolic elements. The female figure wore miniature jewelry blessed in Isis's name, while the child figure was shaped from clay mixed with water from the sacred lake of a nearby temple. Every morning for 30 days, Amaniadis would hold these figures while reciting words that connected her directly to Isis's own experience of conception and birth. But here's what makes this ritual so fascinating from a historical perspective. It wasn't based on passive hope or superstitious pleading. The words Amaniadis spoke were designed to help her embody the same confidence and creative power that had allowed Isis to conceive Horus under seemingly impossible circumstances. The ritual required Amenirdis to visualize herself not as a desperate woman begging for divine intervention, but as a goddess in her own right, capable of channeling the same life-creating energy that flowed through Isis herself. This psychological transformation was considered just as important as any supernatural assistance the goddess might provide. Historical records suggest that Amenirdis did eventually conceive, though whether we attribute this to divine intervention, psychological factors, or simple coincidence matters less than understanding what this story reveals about Egyptian religious practice. These weren't people who saw themselves as powerless mortals hoping for miraculous rescue. They were individuals who believed they could access and channel genuine divine power through their own actions and understanding. This brings us to one of the most revolutionary aspects of how Isis and Hathor were worshipped. Unlike many ancient deities who demanded fear and submission, these goddesses were approached as teachers and partners. Egyptian women didn't just pray to them for help with fertility, love, or protection. They sought to learn from them, to understand the secrets of their power, and ultimately to become like them. The clearest example of this partnership approach can be found in the story of Hekanakti, a farmer whose letters and accounts, discovered by archaeologists, provide an unprecedented glimpse into the daily life of an ancient Egyptian family. Hekanakti's correspondence reveals that when his teenage daughter Naunakte fell seriously ill, the family's response went far beyond simply offering prayers and sacrifices. Hekanakte's wife E took charge of their daughter's healing process, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations of women in her family. She began by consulting the local oracle of Isis, but this wasn't a passive consultation where she simply received divine pronouncements. Instead, the oracle taught EY specific techniques for channeling Isis's healing power through her own hands and voice. For 7 days, I performed a ritual that required her to place her hands on different parts of her daughter's body while speaking words that identified specific aspects of Isis's own power with different organs and systems. When she touched Nonakta's forehead, she invoked Isis's wisdom. When she placed her hands over the girl's heart, she called upon the goddess's capacity for love that could overcome any obstacle. When she touched her daughter's abdomen, she channeled Isis's fertility magic, reimagining it as the power to regenerate and heal. But perhaps most significantly, Iwai was taught to see herself during these moments not as a worried mother, appealing to a distant goddess, but as Isis herself, working through human form to restore balance and health. This wasn't considered blasphemous or presumptuous. It was the natural expression of Egyptian belief that divine power flowed through human beings when they aligned themselves properly with cosmic forces. The recovery of young Naunakta, documented in her father's relieved letters to relatives, demonstrates something crucial about how these goddesses functioned in Egyptian society. They weren't supernatural beings who occasionally intervened in human affairs from some distant realm. They were understood as forces that operated through human consciousness and action when people learned to access them correctly. This understanding helps explain why the worship of Isis and Hathor spread far beyond Egypt's borders, eventually reaching every corner of the ancient world. When Greek and Roman women encountered these goddesses, they weren't just adopting foreign deities. They were discovering spiritual technologies that promised to unlock their own innate feminine power. The story of Lucius Apuleius, a Roman writer who underwent initiation into the mysteries of Isis in the 2nd century CE, provides our most detailed account of what this transformative process actually involved. Though Apuleius wrote in metaphorical language to protect the sacred secrets he had sworn to guard, his description suggests an experience that fundamentally altered participants' understanding of their own capabilities. According to Apuleius, the initiation process began with a period of purification that wasn't merely about ritual cleanliness. Candidates were taught to release limiting beliefs about human powerlessness and divine distance. They learned to see themselves as temporary incarnations of eternal cosmic forces, with the potential to access the same creative and transformative energies that flowed through the goddesses themselves. The climax of the initiation involved a symbolic death and rebirth that paralleled Isis's resurrection of Osiris. But rather than simply witnessing or commemorating this mythological event, initiates were taught to experience it directly. They learned to identify so completely with Isis's power that they could feel themselves capable of the same miraculous transformations she had performed. This wasn't mere psychological theatre or religious symbolism. Ancient sources suggest that people who completed these initiations often demonstrated remarkable changes in their personal circumstances. Women who had been considered barren suddenly conceived. Men who had failed in business ventures found new success. Individuals who had suffered from chronic illnesses experienced dramatic healing. Modern skeptics might dismiss such accounts as coincidence or placebo effects, but missing the point entirely. Whether the changes were supernatural or psychological matters, less than recognizing that these practices gave people access to aspects of their own potential that they hadn't known how to reach before. The secret lay in understanding that Isis and Hathor weren't external deities who might or might not choose to grant requests. They were archetypal patterns of feminine power that existed within human consciousness itself, waiting to be awakened and expressed through proper knowledge and practice. This reveals why the seductive power attributed to these goddesses was so much more than simple sexual attraction. When ancient texts describe Isis seducing Osiris back to life, they're describing the power of feminine creative energy to literally call new realities into existence. When they tell stories of Hathor's irresistible charm, transforming violent conflicts into joyful celebrations, they're illustrating how joy and beauty could reshape the most challenging circumstances. Egyptian women who mastered these principles didn't just become more attractive to potential partners. They became magnetic forces that drew opportunities, resources, and favorable outcomes toward themselves through their alignment with cosmic creative principles. They learned to embody the same confidence that had allowed Isis to challenge even the sun god Ra when she needed to protect her son Horus. Consider the remarkable case of Neithotep, a woman whose story emerges from administrative records found at the Deir el-Medina workers' village. Originally married to a relatively low-ranking stone cutter, Neithotep found herself widowed with 3 young children and no obvious means of support. In most ancient societies, this would have meant destitution or dependence on male relatives. But Neithotep had been trained in the mysteries of Hathor from childhood, and she understood something that gave her options others might not have seen. She knew that Hathor's power wasn't limited to fertility and sexuality. The goddess also governed music, dance, and all forms of artistic expression that brought joy and beauty into the world. Rather than seeing her situation as hopeless, Neithotep recognized an opportunity to channel Hathor's creative energy into a form of economic independence that was unusual, but not unprecedented in Egyptian society. She began teaching other women the sacred dances and songs associated with Hathor's worship, but she didn't limit herself to religious contexts. Neithotep discovered that wealthy families were eager to hire skilled performers for private celebrations, wedding ceremonies, and festivals. But more than that, she learned that women who had mastered the art of embodying Hathor's joyful energy were in demand as consultants for other women facing challenges in love, marriage, and family life. Within 2 years, Neithotep had built what we might recognize today as a thriving coaching and entertainment business. She employed several other women, owned property in her own name, and had achieved a level of financial independence that would have been remarkable even for men of her social class. But the key to her success wasn't just practical skill or business acumen. It was her deep understanding of how to channel divine feminine energy into worldly affairs. Neithotep's story illustrates something profound about how these goddesses operated in Egyptian society. They weren't distant figures who occasionally answered prayers. They were practical sources of empowerment that women could learn to embody in their daily lives. When Neithotep taught other women to channel Hathor's energy, she wasn't just sharing dance steps or musical techniques. She was transmitting a technology of consciousness that could transform how people move through the world. The women who studied with Hathor reported changes that went far beyond improved performance abilities. They described feeling more confident in negotiations with merchants, more magnetic in their interactions with potential suitors, and more capable of creating harmony in their households. These weren't mystical transformations happening in temple ceremonies. These were practical skills being applied in markets, homes, and social gatherings across the city. But to understand how revolutionary this really was, we need to look at what was happening simultaneously in other parts of the ancient world. While Egyptian women were learning to channel goddess energy into economic independence and social influence, women in many other cultures were being taught that their highest aspiration should be invisible submission to male authority. The contrast becomes stark when we examine the life of Tawassret, a woman who rose from relatively modest origins to become one of Egypt's most successful female pharaohs. Unlike Hatshepsut, who had to justify her rule through male royal bloodlines, or Nefertiti, who derived her power through marriage to Akhenaten, Tawassret achieved the throne through her own mastery of the principles embodied by Isis and Hathor. Tawassret began her career as a secondary wife to Pharaoh Seti II, a position that in most ancient monarchies would have meant a life of comfortable obscurity. But Tawassret understood something about feminine power that set her apart from other royal women. She studied not just the rituals associated with goddess worship, but the deeper principles of how divine feminine energy operated in political contexts. When Seti died unexpectedly, leaving only a young stepson as heir, Tawassret didn't simply accept the role of regent that court officials offered her. Instead, she began systematically demonstrating that she possessed the same divine authorization that legitimized male pharaohs. She commissioned temple reliefs showing herself in direct communication with both Isis and Hathor. But these weren't mere propaganda pieces. They were visual representations of genuine spiritual practices that she had mastered. The key to Tawassret's success lay in understanding that pharaonic power wasn't based on masculine strength or military conquest. It was based on the ability to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos from destroying civilization. And Ma'at was fundamentally a feminine principle associated with the goddess of the same name, who was often depicted as Isis's sister or companion. Tawassret learned to present herself not as a woman trying to fulfill a masculine role, but as the living embodiment of the feminine principles that made effective rulership possible. When she appeared before court officials or foreign ambassadors, she didn't try to project masculine authority. Instead, she embodied the serene confidence of Isis, the joyful magnetism of Hathor, and the perfect balance of Ma'at. The result was unprecedented. Foreign rulers, who might have dismissed a female pharaoh as illegitimate, found themselves strangely compelled by Tawassret's presence. Court officials who had initially planned to limit her authority discovered that her decisions consistently produced better outcomes than their own recommendations. Military commanders who had expected to manipulate a weak female ruler found themselves genuinely inspired by her leadership. Tawassret's reign lasted for 7 years, during which Egypt experienced remarkable stability and prosperity. But perhaps more importantly, her success demonstrated something that would influence Egyptian queenship for centuries to come. That feminine divine power wasn't a limitation to be overcome in positions of authority. It was an advantage that could be deliberately cultivated and strategically deployed. This understanding helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of ancient Egyptian history: why this civilization consistently produced powerful queens and female pharaohs, while most other ancient cultures relegated women to subordinate roles. The answer wasn't that Egyptian men were unusually enlightened about gender equality. It was that Egyptian spiritual technology provided women with practical methods for accessing and expressing real power. The techniques that Tawassret used to establish her authority were variations of the same practices that allowed ordinary women like Neithotep to create economic independence, or Amenirdis to overcome infertility. They were all expressions of a fundamental understanding about how consciousness could be aligned with cosmic forces to produce desired outcomes in the material world. To see how sophisticated this understanding had become, we need to examine the story of Ankhesenamun's final gambit. Remember, we left the young widow of Tutankhamun standing before her shrine to Isis, facing the prospect of political extinction. What happened next reveals the most audacious application of goddess power in Egyptian history. Rather than accepting marriage to one of the court officials who were maneuvering for control of the throne, Ankhesenamun made a decision that shocked the ancient world. She wrote a letter to Suppiluliuma, the king of the Hittites, Egypt's traditional enemies, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh of Egypt. This wasn't desperation. This was calculated strategy based on deep understanding of how Isis's power operated. The goddess had faced seemingly impossible odds when Osiris was murdered and dismembered by Set. She had been alone, powerless, and threatened with complete destruction. But rather than accepting defeat, Isis had used her knowledge of secret names and magical techniques to transform the situation entirely. Ankhesenamun applied the same principle. Instead of trying to work within the existing power structure, where she had no leverage, she created an entirely new set of possibilities by reaching beyond the boundaries that others considered fixed. She understood that Isis's seductive power wasn't limited to personal relationships. It could reshape political realities on an international scale. The letter she sent to Suppiluliuma reveals remarkable sophistication in how she framed her proposal. She didn't present herself as a desperate widow seeking protection. Instead, she positioned herself as a living goddess, offering to share divine authority with whichever Hittite prince proved worthy of the honor. She described the match not as a political alliance, but as a sacred marriage between divine forces that would bring unprecedented prosperity to both kingdoms. The Hittite king was initially skeptical, suspecting some kind of trap or deception. But when his ambassadors arrived in Egypt to investigate Ankhesenamun's proposal, they found themselves dealing with a woman who embodied the same compelling presence that had made Tawosret so effective as a ruler. She received them not as a suppliant hoping for rescue, but as Isis herself, graciously offering to extend her divine favor to foreign royalty. The negotiations that followed reveal how thoroughly Ankhesenamun had mastered the principles of goddess power. She didn't argue or plead her case. Instead, she created an atmosphere of such magnetic attraction around the possibilities she offered that the Hittite ambassadors found themselves competing for her attention rather than interrogating her motives. She understood something that modern negotiators often miss, that the most powerful form of persuasion doesn't involve pushing people toward your desired outcome. It involves making that outcome so attractive that they pull themselves toward it. This was exactly how Hathor was said to have tamed violent gods, not through force or argument, but by embodying such irresistible joy and beauty that conflict simply dissolved in her presence. Unfortunately for Ankhesenamun, her strategy was too radical for the established powers in both kingdoms. The Hittite prince sent to marry her was murdered while traveling to Egypt, almost certainly on the orders of Egyptian court officials who refused to allow foreign rule. Ankhesenamun herself disappeared from historical records shortly afterward, probably eliminated by the same forces that had killed her intended husband. But her story demonstrates something crucial about the potential scope of goddess power as Egyptians understood it. These weren't deities whose influence was limited to personal matters or religious ceremonies. They embodied principles that could reshape entire civilizations when properly understood and applied. The tragic end of Ankhesenamun's story also illustrates why the worship of Isis and Hathor sometimes faced resistance from established authorities. Women who truly mastered these principles didn't just become more successful within existing systems. They became capable of creating entirely new systems that challenged traditional power structures. This dynamic becomes even clearer when we examine how these goddesses were worshipped in the great temple complexes that dominated Egyptian cities. The Temple of Isis at Philae, considered one of the most beautiful religious sites in the ancient world, wasn't just a place where people came to pray for divine intervention. It was essentially a university where women from across the Mediterranean world came to study the advanced techniques of consciousness transformation that Egyptian priestesses had developed over centuries. The curriculum at Philae was remarkably comprehensive. Beginning students learned basic techniques for aligning their personal energy with cosmic forces through meditation, dance, and ritual practices. Intermediate students studied the mythological cycles associated with Isis and Hathor, not as religious stories, but as coded instructions for navigating specific life challenges. But the advanced levels of training went far beyond anything we might recognize as conventional religious education. Senior priestesses learned techniques for what we might call reality engineering, systematic methods for manifesting desired outcomes through precise alignment of consciousness with natural forces. These weren't vague visualization exercises or positive thinking techniques. They were sophisticated practices based on detailed understanding of how human consciousness interacted with what Egyptians called the Neteru, the fundamental principles that governed all manifestation in the physical world. The story of Isidora, a Greek woman who traveled to Philae in the 1st century BCE, provides our most detailed account of what this advanced training actually involved. Isidora's letters to her sister in Athens describe practices that sound almost like ancient versions of modern quantum physics, involving precise manipulation of what she called the threads of possibility that connected all things. According to Isidora, the most advanced priestesses could literally see these connections as luminous strands linking people, events, and outcomes across space and time. They learned to identify which strands needed to be strengthened or weakened to produce desired changes in the material world. This wasn't considered supernatural manipulation. It was understood as conscious participation in the same creative processes that Isis used to resurrect Osiris and that Hathor employed to maintain cosmic harmony. The practical applications of these techniques were extraordinary. Isidora describes witnessing a senior priestess help a merchant who had lost his entire fortune to pirates. Rather than simply offering prayers for better luck, the priestess taught the man to identify the specific patterns of thought and emotion that had attracted his misfortune. She then guided him through a systematic process of realigning his consciousness with the prosperity principles embodied by Hathor. Within 6 months, the merchant had not only recovered his losses, but had established the most successful trading network in the Eastern Mediterranean. More importantly, he had learned to maintain his alignment with divine abundance in ways that made future setbacks essentially impossible. This story illustrates something crucial about how these goddesses functioned in Egyptian spiritual technology. They weren't external beings who might choose to grant or deny requests based on arbitrary preferences. They were archetypal patterns of cosmic law that operated with perfect consistency when properly understood and applied. The seductive power attributed to both Isis and Hathor was really the attractive force of natural law itself. When someone learned to embody these principles completely, they became irresistibly magnetic because they were expressing the same creative forces that maintained the universe itself. This understanding explains why Egyptian art consistently depicted these goddesses as supremely beautiful and alluring. They weren't trying to suggest that divine power required physical attractiveness. They were illustrating the principle that perfect alignment with cosmic law naturally produced a magnetic presence that others found compelling. The women who mastered these teachings didn't become seductive through manipulation or artificial enhancement. They became irresistible because they embodied the same creative joy and life-affirming confidence that made existence itself attractive and worthwhile. Perhaps nowhere is this principle more clearly demonstrated than in the story of Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of ancient Egypt. Modern popular culture has reduced Cleopatra to a stereotypical image of exotic sexuality and political manipulation. But this completely misses the real source of her remarkable influence over some of history's most powerful men. Cleopatra was the final product of a royal educational system that had spent centuries perfecting the techniques originally associated with Isis and Hathor worship. By her time, these practices had evolved into a sophisticated curriculum that prepared Egyptian queens to function as living goddesses in political contexts. When Julius Caesar first encountered Cleopatra, he wasn't meeting a desperate woman trying to seduce him into supporting her claim to the throne. He was confronting someone who had spent her entire life learning to embody the same divine feminine principles that had made Egypt the most stable and prosperous civilization in the ancient world. The famous story of Cleopatra arriving to meet Caesar wrapped in a carpet wasn't a seduction technique. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of the principle that true power could transform any situation, no matter how constrained or hopeless it might appear. Like Isis emerging from the underworld with Osiris restored to life, Cleopatra emerged from apparent powerlessness, with her authority not just intact but enhanced. Caesar's attraction to Cleopatra wasn't based on her physical beauty, though historical accounts suggest she was indeed lovely. It was based on her demonstration that she possessed something he had never encountered before: access to a form of power that operated through attraction rather than force, through creative transformation rather than destructive conquest. This same dynamic repeated itself years later when Cleopatra formed her alliance with Mark Antony. Again, popular culture has reduced their relationship to a simple love affair, missing the deeper significance of what was actually happening between them. Antony was a military commander whose entire career had been built on traditional masculine principles of aggression and domination. But when he encountered Cleopatra, he discovered something that Roman culture had never taught him to recognize: that feminine creative power could achieve outcomes that masculine force could never reach. The barge on which Cleopatra traveled to meet Antony wasn't designed for seduction in any conventional sense. It was a floating temple dedicated to Hathor, designed to create an atmosphere where the joy and beauty principles embodied by the goddess could operate at full strength. When Antony stepped aboard that vessel, he wasn't just meeting a foreign queen. He was entering a reality where different laws of attraction and influence were in operation. The transformation that Antony underwent during his years with Cleopatra wasn't the result of manipulation or emotional dependency. It was the natural consequence of exposure to a form of consciousness that Roman culture had systematically suppressed. He learned to appreciate the creative potential of joy, beauty, and celebration in ways that his military training had never allowed him to explore. But perhaps most importantly, Cleopatra taught Antony something that would have revolutionary implications if it had been allowed to spread throughout the Roman world: that true power wasn't about conquering others, but about inspiring them to want to participate in your vision of what was possible. This principle was at the heart of everything that Isis and Hathor represented in Egyptian spirituality. They didn't rule through fear or domination. They attracted devotion by embodying possibilities that people instinctively recognized as more fulfilling than whatever they were currently experiencing. The tragedy of Cleopatra's story wasn't that she failed to seduce Octavian as effectively as she had won over Caesar and Antony. It was that the Roman political system was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of power she represented. Rome was built on principles of hierarchy, conquest, and control. Egypt was built on principles of harmony, creativity, and cooperative participation in cosmic order. When these two worldviews collided, the more aggressive system temporarily triumphed through superior military force, but the victory was Pyrrhic in ways that Roman leaders couldn't have anticipated. By destroying the last center of authentic goddess worship in the ancient world, They eliminated a form of knowledge that could have prevented many of the problems that would eventually destroy their own empire. The Romans never learned what Egyptian women had known for thousands of years, that sustainable power must be based on attraction rather than coercion, on creative collaboration rather than destructive competition. They never understood that the seductive power of goddesses like Isis and Hathor wasn't a threat to legitimate authority. It was the foundation upon which all legitimate authority ultimately rested. This brings us to perhaps the most important question raised by these ancient stories. What happened to the knowledge and practices that had made Egyptian goddess worship so effective? Why did these powerful spiritual technologies disappear from human civilization? And what would it mean if they could be recovered and applied in the modern world? The answer to that question requires us to follow the hidden streams through which this knowledge continued to flow, long after the last temples of Isis and Hathor had been closed by Christian emperors. Because while the public worship of these goddesses ended, the principles they embodied were too valuable to be completely lost. The survival of these ancient teachings took forms that would have been almost unrecognizable to the priestesses of Philae, yet the essential principles remained intact, hidden within mystery schools, encoded in alchemical texts, and preserved through lineages of women who passed knowledge from mother to daughter in whispers and coded gestures. The core understanding of feminine divine power continued to pulse beneath the surface of civilizations that had officially rejected it. Consider the story of Helena, a woman whose name appears in fragmentary manuscripts discovered in a monastery library in Alexandria during the 14th century. Helena lived in Constantinople during the height of the Byzantine Empire, a world where Christian orthodoxy had supposedly erased all traces of pagan goddess worship. Yet the details that emerge from these manuscripts reveal something extraordinary. Helena had somehow gained access to practices that were virtually identical to the advanced techniques once taught in Egyptian temples. Helena wasn't a rebel or a heretic in any obvious sense. She was the wife of a successful silk merchant, mother to 4 children, and by all external appearances, a devout Christian woman who attended church services regularly and contributed generously to local charities. But within the private spaces of her home, Helena maintained a shrine that would have been instantly recognizable to any priestess of Isis. The manuscripts describe how Helena would begin each day by lighting oil lamps arranged in the pattern of the constellation Sopdet, which the Egyptians had associated with Isis. She would then perform movements that the texts call sacred dances, though the descriptions make clear these were the same ritualized gestures once used to channel goddess energy in temples along the Nile. But Helena's practices went far beyond private devotion. Like her ancient predecessors, she understood that divine feminine power was meant to be expressed through practical action in the world. She began by helping other women in her neighborhood who faced challenges similar to those that had once brought pilgrims to Egyptian goddess temples. When Marina, the baker's daughter, found herself pregnant and abandoned by her lover, she came to Helena not seeking charity, but guidance. What Helena taught her reveals the remarkable continuity of ancient wisdom traditions, despite centuries of official suppression. Rather than simply offering comfort or practical assistance, Helena guided Marina through a process of inner transformation that was essentially identical to rituals once performed in the Temple of Isis. Helena taught Marina to visualize herself not as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but as a goddess facing the same challenge that Isis had confronted when she found herself alone and pregnant with Horus after Osiris's death. The young woman learned to draw strength not from self-pity or anger, but from identification with divine feminine power that had successfully navigated similar situations. The results were remarkable. Marina didn't simply survive her ordeal or find ways to cope with difficult circumstances. She transformed herself into someone who attracted the support and opportunities she needed. Within months, she had established her own bakery, married a man who welcomed both her and her child, and become a pillar of strength for other women facing similar challenges. But perhaps most significantly, Marina began teaching other women the same techniques that Helena had shared with her. She understood that this knowledge wasn't meant to be hoarded or kept secret. It was designed to spread from woman to woman, creating networks of feminine empowerment that could operate beneath the radar of official religious and political authorities. This pattern repeated itself across the Byzantine world and beyond. In Venice, a woman named Lucrezia maintained what appeared to be a respectable finishing school for daughters of merchant families, but was actually a center where young women learned advanced techniques of consciousness transformation, disguised as lessons in music, dance, and domestic arts. In Córdoba, during the height of Islamic Spain, a woman known only as Fatima al-Andalusia taught Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women practices that transcended religious boundaries and connected them directly to the same cosmic principles that had once been embodied by Egyptian goddesses. These women weren't trying to recreate ancient Egyptian religion or challenge the dominant spiritual authorities of their time. They were preserving and adapting essential knowledge about how feminine consciousness could access and direct creative forces that most people had forgotten existed. They understood something that modern historians often miss, that the most powerful revolutionary movements operate not through direct confrontation with existing power structures, but through the quiet cultivation of alternative possibilities. The story of Marguerite Porete illustrates both the potential and the dangers of this hidden transmission. Marguerite lived in northern France during the late 13th century, a time when the Catholic Church was systematically eliminating any form of spirituality that operated outside official channels. She was a beguine, a member of communities of women who had chosen lives of spiritual devotion without taking formal religious vows or submitting to male ecclesiastical authority. On the surface, Marguerite appeared to be a conventional mystic, writing about her personal relationship with Christ. But careful analysis of her masterwork, The Mirror of Simple Souls, reveals that she had somehow gained access to the same understanding of consciousness transformation that had once been taught in Egyptian mystery schools. Her descriptions of the soul's union with divine love contain encoded instructions for accessing states of awareness that would have been familiar to any advanced priestess of Isis or Hathor. Marguerite wrote about the soul learning to operate from what she called the state of the annihilated soul, a condition where individual will become perfectly aligned with cosmic creative force. This wasn't the self-negation that characterized much of medieval Christian mysticism. It was the same principle that had allowed Egyptian women to channel goddess energy by identifying completely with divine archetypal patterns. The practical implications of Marguerite's teachings were revolutionary. Women who mastered her techniques didn't just experience personal spiritual transformation, they gained access to the same kind of reality-shaping power that had made Egyptian priestesses so influential in their communities. They became magnetic centers that attracted resources, opportunities, and devoted followers without any apparent effort or manipulation. But Marguerite made a fatal error that her Egyptian predecessors had carefully avoided. Instead of keeping her most advanced teachings within trusted circles of initiated women, she wrote them down in a book that could be read by anyone, including church authorities who recognized the threat such knowledge represented to their monopoly on spiritual power. The Inquisition moved swiftly to suppress both Marguerite and her teachings. She was burned at the stake in Paris in 1310, and most copies of her book were destroyed. But the ideas she had articulated were too powerful to be completely eliminated. They continued to circulate in underground networks of women who understood that such knowledge must be preserved, even at great personal risk. The Renaissance brought new opportunities for the transmission of these ancient principles, though always in forms that were carefully disguised to avoid persecution. The story of Caterina Sforza, the Italian noblewoman who ruled the cities of Imola and Forlì during the late 15th century, demonstrates how thoroughly some women had mastered the art of wielding goddess-like power within the constraints of patriarchal political systems. Caterina wasn't born into power the way many Renaissance rulers were. She gained her position through marriage to Girolamo Riario, nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. But when Girolamo was assassinated in a conspiracy aimed at eliminating the Riario family's influence, Caterina faced the same kind of impossible situation that had once challenged women like Ankhesenamun and Taosret. Rather than accepting the loss of her position or seeking protection through remarriage to another powerful man, Caterina responded in ways that revealed her deep understanding of principles that had once been associated with Isis and Hathor. She began by performing what appeared to be a dramatic gesture of defiance, but was actually a carefully calculated demonstration of the same reality-transforming power that Egyptian goddesses had embodied. When the conspirators who had killed her husband seized control of the fortress that controlled her territories, they offered to negotiate her safe passage out of the region in exchange for her formal abdication of all claims to authority. Caterina's response became legendary throughout Europe. She appeared on the walls of the fortress they controlled and lifted her skirts, exposing her genitals while shouting that she possessed the means to produce more heirs and would never surrender her children's inheritance. Modern historians often interpret this incident as either an act of desperation or a crude attempt at psychological warfare. But viewed through the lens of Egyptian spiritual technology, Caterina's gesture reveals something far more sophisticated. She was invoking the same principle that had made Hathor so powerful: the recognition that feminine creative energy was the ultimate source of all political authority and social stability. By exposing the physical source of her fertility in such a dramatic context, Caterina was essentially declaring herself to be a living goddess whose creative power transcended any temporary military or political setbacks. She was reminding everyone present that while men might control armies and fortresses, women controlled the far more fundamental power of bringing new life into existence. The psychological impact of this demonstration was extraordinary. The conspirators who had seemed so confident in their victory suddenly found themselves uncertain about their position. How could they claim legitimate authority over territories when the woman who embodied the creative principle itself refused to acknowledge their power? The gesture created such confusion among Caterina's enemies that she was able to escape and begin organizing the resistance that would eventually restore her to full control of her domains. But Caterina's mastery of goddess principles went far beyond dramatic gestures and psychological manipulation. Like her Egyptian predecessors, she understood that true feminine power operated through the ability to create irresistible attraction toward desired outcomes rather than through force or coercion. During the years when she ruled independently, Caterina transformed her territories into some of the most prosperous and stable regions in Italy. She accomplished this not through military conquest or political alliances, but through her remarkable ability to inspire cooperation and loyalty among people who had previously been enemies or competitors. Foreign ambassadors who visited Caterina's court reported being surprised by the atmosphere they encountered. Instead of the tense formality that characterized most Renaissance political centers, they found an environment that somehow combined serious governance with celebration and joy. Caterina had learned to embody the same principle that had made Hathor's temples such attractive gathering places: the understanding that effective leadership must be based on making people genuinely want to participate, rather than forcing their compliance. The techniques that Caterina used to create this atmosphere were variations of practices that had once been taught in Egyptian mystery schools. She began each day with private rituals that aligned her consciousness with what she called the sacred forces of creation and harmony. She understood that her personal energy state would influence everyone around her, so she made sure to cultivate within herself the same joy, confidence, and creative enthusiasm that she wanted to see reflected in her subjects. During public appearances, Caterina moved and spoke in ways that had been carefully designed to channel what Egyptian priestesses would have recognized as goddess energy. She didn't try to project masculine authority or intimidate people into submission. Instead, she embodied such compelling feminine presence that others naturally wanted to please her and support her initiatives. The results were remarkable. Katerina's territories experienced unprecedented economic growth, cultural flowering, and social harmony. Crime rates dropped dramatically, trade flourished. Artists and scholars flocked to her court. People who had lived in the region for generations reported that they had never experienced such prosperity and contentment. But perhaps most significantly, women throughout Italy began seeking opportunities to visit Caterina's domains and learn from her example. They recognized that she had discovered something that could transform their own lives and communities. Without any formal teaching program or religious organization, Caterina became the center of an informal network of women who were rediscovering the same principles that had once made Egyptian goddess worship so influential. These women didn't think of themselves as reviving ancient pagan traditions or challenging Christian authority. They simply recognized that Caterina had access to forms of knowledge that could make their lives more fulfilling and effective. They learned by observation and imitation rather than through formal instruction, gradually mastering the same consciousness transformation techniques that had been preserved through centuries of careful transmission. The impact of this informal renaissance of feminine spiritual technology extended far beyond Caterina's immediate territories. Women who had learned these principles in her court returned to their own communities and began applying them in contexts that ranged from family relationships to business enterprises to artistic endeavors. Consider the story of Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, who visited Caterina's court as a young woman and left with an understanding of feminine power that would make her one of the most influential cultural figures of the Renaissance. Isabella didn't try to copy Caterina's political methods directly. Instead, she adapted the underlying principles to her own situation and interests. Isabella understood that her position as the wife of a minor Italian prince gave her limited direct political power, but she also recognized that cultural influence could be just as transformative as military or political authority, especially if it was wielded with the same consciousness-shaping techniques that had made Caterina so effective as a ruler. Isabella began by creating what appeared to be a conventional Renaissance court, focused on patronage of the arts and literary culture. But the atmosphere she cultivated was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in Europe. Artists, writers, musicians, and scholars who visited Mantua reported experiencing a form of creative inspiration that they had never encountered before. Isabella had learned to embody the same principle that had made Hathor the patroness of artistic expression in ancient Egypt. The understanding that true creativity emerged when individual consciousness was aligned with cosmic creative forces. She didn't simply hire talented people and provide them with resources. She created an environment where their deepest creative potential could be awakened and expressed. The techniques Isabella used were subtle but remarkably effective. She began each day with private practices that connected her consciousness to what she thought of as the divine source of beauty and harmony. During interactions with artists and scholars, she spoke and moved in ways that somehow made them feel more creative and inspired than they did in ordinary circumstances. People who spent time in Isabella's presence often reported that ideas and insights seemed to flow through them more freely than usual. Musicians found themselves composing melodies that surprised them with their beauty. Writers discovered words and images emerging from depths of inspiration they hadn't known they possessed. Visual artists experienced breakthrough moments where their technical skills seemed to be guided by forces beyond their normal capabilities. This wasn't the result of any conventional teaching or mentoring on Isabella's part. She rarely gave direct artistic advice or instruction. Instead, she had learned to create fields of consciousness that activated the creative potential that already existed within the people around her. She functioned as a catalyst that allowed others to access aspects of their own abilities that they hadn't known how to reach. The cultural transformation that resulted from Isabella's influence extended throughout Europe and lasted for centuries. Many of the greatest masterpieces of Renaissance art, literature, and music emerged from networks of creative individuals who had been directly or indirectly influenced by the consciousness transformation techniques that she had learned from Katerina and adapted to cultural contexts. But perhaps most importantly, Isabella demonstrated something that had profound implications for how feminine spiritual power could operate in the modern world. She showed that these ancient principles didn't require formal religious contexts or mystical practices that were separate from ordinary life. They could be integrated into any activity or profession in ways that enhanced, rather than contradicted, practical effectiveness. This integration of spiritual technology with worldly success became increasingly important as the knowledge preserved from Egyptian goddess traditions began to encounter the challenges and opportunities of the emerging modern world. The story of Catherine de' Medici, the Italian noblewoman who became Queen of France during the 16th century, illustrates both the potential and the limitations of trying to apply these principles within the context of increasingly centralized political systems. Catherine had been educated in the same tradition that had influenced Caterina Sforza and Isabella d'Este. She understood the consciousness transformation techniques that could make feminine power irresistibly attractive and practically effective. But she also faced challenges that were unprecedented in the history of these teachings. As Queen of France during a period of religious civil war, Catherine couldn't simply create harmonious environments where people naturally wanted to cooperate. She was dealing with conflicts that had been deliberately inflamed by political and religious authorities who had vested interests in maintaining division and hostility. The traditional goddess approach of transforming opposition through attraction and inspiration wasn't sufficient for dealing with systematic campaigns of hatred and violence. Catherine's response revealed both the adaptability and the potential dark side of ancient feminine spiritual technology. She began incorporating techniques that had once been associated with more martial aspects of Egyptian goddess worship, particularly those connected to Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who represented the fierce protective power that emerged when creative feminine energy was threatened or blocked. This wasn't the gentle, nurturing femininity that most people associated with goddess worship. This was the same force that had allowed Isis to defeat the sun god Ra when he refused to heal her son Horus from a scorpion sting. It was the power that emerged when maternal protective instincts were combined with complete mastery of consciousness transformation techniques. Catherine learned to project what her contemporaries described as an almost supernatural ability to see through deception and manipulation. People who tried to lie to her or conceal their true intentions found themselves inexplicably compelled to reveal information they had planned to keep secret. Political opponents who attempted to outmaneuver her discovered that she seemed to anticipate their strategies before they had fully formed them in their own minds. But perhaps most remarkably, Catherine developed the ability to influence large groups of people through what appeared to be direct transmission of emotional and mental states. During public appearances, she could somehow calm hostile crowds or inspire confidence among her supporters through her mere presence, without saying anything that would account for such dramatic shifts in collective mood. These abilities made Catherine one of the most effective rulers in French history, but they also attracted the kind of suspicion and fear that had always surrounded women who demonstrated genuine mastery of consciousness transformation techniques. Rumors began circulating that she was practicing witchcraft or had made pacts with demonic forces to gain her remarkable influence over people and events. The irony was profound. Catherine was actually applying spiritual technologies that had once been considered the highest expression of divine feminine wisdom. But because the knowledge of these principles had been driven underground and distorted by centuries of suppression, people could only interpret her abilities through the lens of superstition and demonology. This dynamic would continue to plague women who demonstrated exceptional consciousness transformation abilities throughout the early modern period. The same techniques that had once made Egyptian priestesses revered as living goddesses now made their practitioners suspect as witches and heretics. The knowledge survived, but the cultural context that could properly understand and appreciate it had been systematically destroyed. The witch trials that swept through Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries represented the final, desperate attempt by patriarchal authorities to eliminate the last vestiges of authentic feminine spiritual power. But like all attempts to destroy essential knowledge through violence and intimidation, the persecution was ultimately counterproductive. Rather than eliminating the consciousness transformation techniques that had been preserved from Egyptian goddess traditions, the witch trials forced them to evolve into forms that were even more subtle and harder to detect. Women who might have once taught these principles openly within religious or educational contexts learned to embed them within domestic activities, folk traditions, and informal networks of mutual support. The story of Anne Hutchinson in colonial Massachusetts illustrates how thoroughly these ancient principles had adapted to new cultural environments while maintaining their essential effectiveness. Anne appeared to be nothing more than a devoted Puritan housewife who hosted Bible study meetings for other women in her community. But the content of these gatherings reveals something extraordinary. Anne had somehow preserved and adapted techniques that were virtually identical to those once taught in Egyptian mystery schools. Anne taught the women who attended her meetings that they could receive direct revelation from divine sources without requiring interpretation or authorization from male religious authorities. This wasn't the passive reception of mystical experiences that characterized much of Christian spirituality. Anne was teaching active techniques for aligning consciousness with what she called the immediate presence of the Holy Spirit. The practices she shared were remarkably similar to methods that Egyptian priestesses had once used to channel goddess energy. Anne taught her followers to enter states of consciousness where their individual will become perfectly aligned with divine creative force, allowing them to access wisdom and power that transcended their ordinary mental capabilities. The women who mastered Anne's teachings didn't just experience personal spiritual transformation. They began demonstrating the same kind of practical effectiveness that had always characterized authentic goddess worship. They became more successful in their domestic responsibilities, more influential in their community relationships, and more capable of attracting the resources and opportunities they needed to support their families. But perhaps most threatening to established authorities, these women began challenging the assumption that religious and political leadership must be exclusively masculine. They argued that if the Holy Spirit could speak directly through women, then women possessed the same divine authorization that male ministers claimed as the basis for their authority. This challenge to patriarchal religious structure was exactly what Puritan authorities had been designed to prevent. Anne Hutchinson was tried for heresy and banished from Massachusetts, but the ideas she had articulated continued to spread through networks of women who understood that such knowledge was too valuable to be surrendered to official persecution. The same dynamic played out in communities throughout colonial America and beyond. Women who had learned consciousness transformation techniques adapted them to whatever cultural and religious context they found themselves in, preserving the essential principles while disguising them in forms that appeared to conform to accepted beliefs and practices. By the time of the American Revolution, these hidden networks of feminine spiritual empowerment had become so widespread and influential that they played crucial roles in supporting the social transformation that made independence possible. Women like Abigail Adams, who famously urged her husband to remember the ladies when creating new forms of government, weren't just expressing personal opinions about political equality. They were speaking from traditions of feminine empowerment that had been preserved through centuries of careful transmission. The consciousness transformation techniques that had once been associated with Isis and Hathor were now being applied to the challenge of creating entirely new forms of social organization based on principles of individual liberty and democratic participation. The same understanding that had allowed Egyptian women to channel divine creative energy was being used to envision and manifest political possibilities that had never existed before in human history. This brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of how ancient Egyptian goddess wisdom survived and evolved through centuries of cultural transformation. Its ability to adapt to new contexts while maintaining its essential effectiveness. The techniques that had once been used to align individual consciousness with cosmic creative forces proved equally valuable for collective efforts to reshape social and political realities. The story of how these principles influenced the development of modern democratic institutions is largely hidden from conventional historical accounts, but the evidence is unmistakable for those who know what to look for. The same consciousness transformation techniques that had once made Egyptian priestesses so effective at manifesting desired outcomes were being applied to the challenge of creating social systems that could harness and channel collective human creative potential. But to understand how this ancient wisdom might be applied in our own time, we need to examine what happened when these hidden traditions finally began to emerge into open expression during the 19th and 20th centuries. The story of how Egyptian goddess principles influenced the development of modern women's movements reveals both the incredible potential and the ongoing challenges of trying to resurrect authentic feminine spiritual power in contemporary contexts. The emergence of these ancient principles into modern consciousness began with a woman whose story reads like something from the pages of Egyptian mythology itself. In 1875, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky sat in a cramped apartment in New York City, surrounded by manuscripts written in languages that most scholars of her time couldn't even identify. But Helena possessed something that set her apart from the academic researchers who dismissed her work. She had somehow gained access to the same direct transmission methods that had once been used to preserve Egyptian goddess wisdom through generations of initiated women. Helena wasn't trying to recreate ancient Egyptian religion or establish herself as a modern priestess. Instead, she understood something far more revolutionary, that the consciousness transformation techniques preserved from antiquity could be adapted to address the spiritual crisis that was emerging in the rapidly industrializing Western world. She recognized that people were losing connection to the same cosmic creative forces that Egyptian women had learned to channel through their goddess practices. The Theosophical Society that Helena founded became a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern spiritual seeking, but not in the way that most people understood. While her public writings focused on philosophical concepts and comparative religion, Helena was actually teaching her inner circle of students practices that were remarkably similar to techniques once used in the temples of Isis and Hathor. Consider the story of Annie Besant, a British woman who encountered Helena's teachings during one of the most desperate periods of her life. Annie had been trapped in an abusive marriage to an Anglican clergyman with no legal rights to her own children or property. When she finally managed to escape, she found herself ostracized by respectable society and struggling to support herself through freelance writing. But when Annie attended her first theosophical meeting, she experienced something that changed the entire trajectory of her existence. Helena had learned to create the same kind of consciousness-altering environment that Egyptian priestesses had once cultivated in their temple gatherings. During that first meeting, Annie felt herself connecting to sources of strength and wisdom that she hadn't known existed. Helena taught Annie techniques that were essentially modernized versions of ancient Egyptian goddess practices. She learned to align her consciousness with what Helena called the divine creative principle, using methods that involved visualization, controlled breathing, and precise mental focus. These weren't abstract spiritual exercises. They were practical tools for accessing the same reality-shaping power that had made Egyptian women so influential in their communities. The transformation that Annie underwent was extraordinary. Within months of beginning her training, she had established herself as one of the most compelling public speakers of her generation. She could address audiences of thousands and somehow make each person feel as though she were speaking directly to their deepest concerns and highest aspirations. This wasn't the result of superior rhetorical training or charismatic personality. Annie had learned to channel the same magnetic presence that had once made goddesses like Hathor irresistibly attractive to their devotees. But Annie's influence extended far beyond public speaking. She became a leader in movements for social reform, women's rights, and educational innovation. Most remarkably, She eventually moved to India, where she played crucial roles in the independence movement and educational reform efforts that transformed an entire subcontinent. The key to Annie's success lay in her understanding of principles that connected her directly to the ancient Egyptian goddess tradition. She had learned that true feminine power wasn't about competing with masculine forms of authority or trying to succeed within systems designed to exclude women. It was about embodying creative forces so compelling that existing structures would naturally transform themselves to accommodate new possibilities. This same understanding influenced another remarkable woman whose story reveals how Egyptian goddess principles were being applied to the challenge of transforming scientific and medical knowledge. Marie Curie, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and the only person to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific disciplines, wasn't just an exceptionally intelligent researcher who happened to succeed despite gender discrimination. Marie had been exposed to consciousness transformation techniques through her involvement with Polish intellectual circles that preserved certain esoteric traditions dating back to medieval mystery schools. These weren't obviously religious or mystical practices. They were methods for enhancing mental clarity, intuitive insight, and the kind of focused attention that could perceive patterns and relationships that others missed. When Marie began her research into radioactive materials, she approached the work with a form of consciousness that would have been recognized by any Egyptian priestess as goddess-aligned awareness. She didn't simply analyze samples and record data in the mechanical way that characterized most scientific research of her time. Instead, she learned to enter states of deep communion with the materials she was studying, allowing her intuitive faculties to guide her toward discoveries that pure logical analysis would never have revealed. The radium that Marie isolated wasn't just the result of superior laboratory technique or mathematical calculation. It emerged from her ability to sense the presence of previously unknown elements through the same kind of direct perception that Egyptian women had once used to identify healing herbs or predict natural phenomena. Marie had learned to align her consciousness with the fundamental creative forces that governed matter itself. But perhaps most significantly, Marie demonstrated how these ancient principles could be applied to collaborative relationships that transcended traditional gender roles. Her partnership with her husband Pierre wasn't based on conventional marriage dynamics, where one partner dominated and the other submitted. Instead, they created a form of conscious collaboration that allowed each person's unique gifts to enhance and amplify the other's capabilities. Pierre possessed exceptional analytical abilities and theoretical insight, but he lacked the intuitive perception that could guide research toward breakthrough discoveries. Marie brought the consciousness transformation skills that could bridge the gap between logical analysis and direct knowing. Together, they created a form of scientific partnership that was essentially a modern application of the same complementary principles that had once been represented by Egyptian divine couples like Isis and Osiris. The discoveries that emerged from their collaboration revolutionized human understanding of matter and energy, but they also demonstrated something equally important, that the consciousness transformation techniques preserved from ancient goddess traditions weren't obsolete relics from humanity's superstitious past. They were sophisticated technologies for accessing forms of awareness that could accelerate human knowledge and capability in any field of endeavor. This principle became even more apparent in the story of Margaret Sanger, the American woman who pioneered the birth control movement and fundamentally transformed women's relationship to their own reproductive power. Margaret's approach to social change revealed her deep understanding of techniques that connected directly to the Egyptian goddess tradition, though she probably never thought of her work in those terms. Margaret didn't try to achieve her goals through conventional political lobbying or legal challenges, though she certainly engaged in those activities. Instead, she understood something that ancient Egyptian women had known intuitively, that lasting social transformation must begin with changes in individual consciousness, particularly women's consciousness about their own power and possibilities. The birth control clinics that Margaret established weren't just medical facilities that provided contraceptive information and devices. They were centers where women could experience a fundamental shift in how they understood their relationship to their own bodies and their own choices. Margaret had learned to create environments where women could connect to the same sense of sovereign feminine power that had once been cultivated through goddess worship. When women visited Margaret's clinics, they didn't just receive practical information about preventing unwanted pregnancies. They experienced something that was essentially a modern version of ancient initiation rituals. They learned to see themselves not as victims of biological processes beyond their control, but as goddesses capable of making conscious choices about when and whether to bring new life into existence. This consciousness transformation had implications that extended far beyond reproductive health. Women who learned to exercise conscious choice about fertility often found themselves capable of exercising conscious choice in other areas of their lives as well. They became more confident in their relationships, more effective in their work, and more capable of manifesting the life circumstances they truly desired. Margaret's influence spread through networks of women who had been transformed by their experiences in her clinics. These weren't formal organizations or political movements in any conventional sense. They were organic networks of feminine empowerment that operated through the same kind of consciousness transmission that had once spread Egyptian goddess wisdom from woman to woman across the ancient world. But perhaps the most remarkable example of how these principles were being applied in the modern world can be found in the story of Eleanor Roosevelt, whose transformation from a shy, insecure young woman into one of the most influential figures of the 20th century reveals the incredible potential that could be unlocked when someone truly mastered ancient goddess principles. Eleanor's early life was marked by the kind of trauma and insecurity that would have destroyed many people's confidence permanently. Orphaned young, raised by relatives who considered her unattractive and socially awkward, married to a man whose mother dominated their household, Eleanor seemed destined for a life of quiet submission and invisible suffering. But during the years when her husband Franklin was recovering from polio, Eleanor underwent a transformation that can only be understood in terms of consciousness-shifting techniques that connected her to the same sources of power that had once been accessed through Egyptian goddess worship. She didn't simply develop greater self-confidence or learn better social skills. She learned to embody a form of feminine authority that made her one of the most compelling and influential people of her generation. Eleanor's approach to public service revealed her deep understanding of principles that would have been immediately recognizable to any priestess of Isis or Hathor. She didn't try to exercise power through domination or manipulation. Instead, she learned to create such compelling visions of human possibility that people naturally wanted to participate in bringing those visions into reality. When Eleanor chaired the United Nations Commission that created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she wasn't just facilitating negotiations between representatives of different governments. She was channeling the same consciousness transformation energy that had once allowed Egyptian goddesses to maintain harmony between conflicting cosmic forces. She created an atmosphere where people who had been enemies could discover shared values and common ground. The techniques Eleanor used were subtle but remarkably effective. She had learned to enter states of consciousness where her individual personality became transparent to what she experienced as universal principles of justice and compassion. When she spoke in these states, people felt as though they were hearing not just one woman's opinions, but truths that resonated with their own deepest values and highest aspirations. This wasn't manipulation or clever rhetoric. Eleanor had mastered the same principle that had made ancient goddesses so influential: the ability to align individual consciousness so completely with cosmic creative forces that her presence became irresistibly attractive to anyone who encountered it. People wanted to cooperate with Eleanor because being around her made them feel more connected to their own best possibilities. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that emerged from Eleanor's leadership wasn't just a political document negotiated through compromise and mutual concession. It was a manifestation of consciousness that had been aligned with fundamental principles governing human dignity and potential. The declaration succeeded because it expressed truths that people recognized intuitively, even when their political positions might have suggested they should oppose such ideas. Eleanor's influence extended throughout the world and lasted far beyond her lifetime. But, perhaps most importantly, she demonstrated that the consciousness transformation techniques preserved from ancient goddess traditions could be applied to challenges that affected all of humanity, not just individual women seeking personal empowerment. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of how Egyptian goddess principles evolved during the 20th century. Their influence on movements for social justice and collective transformation that seem to have nothing to do with feminine spirituality or ancient wisdom traditions. Consider the story of Rosa Parks, whose refusal to give up her bus seat to a white passenger sparked the Montgomery bus boycott and became a catalyst for the entire civil rights movement. Most accounts of this historic moment focus on Rosa's courage and moral conviction, but they miss something crucial. Rosa had been trained in consciousness transformation techniques that connected directly to traditions preserved from ancient goddess worship. Rosa wasn't just a tired seamstress who spontaneously decided to resist racial injustice. She was a seasoned activist who had spent years studying at the Highlander Folk School, where she learned methods for accessing inner sources of strength and clarity that enabled people to maintain dignity and effectiveness, even in the face of violent opposition. The techniques taught at Highlander weren't explicitly connected to ancient Egyptian goddess traditions, but they were based on the same fundamental principles. Students learned to align their individual consciousness with what they understood to be universal forces of justice and truth. They practiced methods for remaining centered and effective even when confronted with hatred, violence, and systematic oppression. When Rosa made her historic decision on that Montgomery bus, she wasn't acting from impulse or emotional reaction. She was operating from the same kind of goddess-aligned consciousness that had once allowed Egyptian women to transform impossible situations through the sheer power of their presence and conviction. She had learned to embody principles that were more compelling than the fear and hatred that supported racial segregation. The bus boycott that followed Rosa's arrest succeeded not just because of superior organization or economic pressure, but because it was guided by people who understood how to channel collective consciousness toward desired outcomes. The leaders of the boycott had learned techniques that were essentially modern applications of methods once used in Egyptian temples to coordinate group rituals and manifestation practices. Martin Luther King Jr., who emerged as the most visible leader of the movement, demonstrated remarkable mastery of consciousness, transformation principles that would have been familiar to any ancient priestess. His speeches weren't just eloquent presentations of political arguments. They were carefully crafted invocations designed to align the consciousness of his audiences with cosmic forces that could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. When Martin spoke about his dream of racial equality, he wasn't just describing personal hopes or political goals. He was channeling the same visionary consciousness that had once allowed Egyptian women to perceive and manifest realities that didn't yet exist in the material world. He had learned to access states of awareness where individual will became perfectly aligned with universal creative principles. The transformation that occurred in American society during the civil rights era wasn't just the result of political organizing or legal challenges, though those certainly played important roles. It was fundamentally a shift in collective consciousness that was guided by people who had mastered ancient techniques for aligning individual and group awareness with forces that could reshape reality itself. But perhaps the most remarkable example of how these principles were being applied in the 20th century can be found in the story of a woman whose work transformed how human beings understand consciousness itself. Carl Jung is often credited as the founder of analytical psychology and the discoverer of concepts like the collective unconscious and psychological archetypes. But the real pioneer of these insights was Tony Wolff, Jung's collaborator and intimate partner, whose understanding of consciousness came directly from traditions that preserved Egyptian goddess wisdom. Toni wasn't just Jung's assistant or romantic interest, though conventional biographical accounts often reduce her to those roles. She was actually the source of many of the most revolutionary ideas that became associated with Jungian psychology. Toni had been initiated into esoteric traditions that maintained direct transmission lines to ancient mystery schools, and she understood consciousness transformation techniques that Jung spent decades trying to comprehend through purely intellectual analysis. The concept of psychological archetypes that became central to Jung's work wasn't his original discovery. Toni had learned from her esoteric teachers that human consciousness was naturally connected to universal patterns that ancient Egyptians had personified as gods and goddesses. She understood that figures like Isis and Hathor weren't just mythological characters or psychological symbols. They were actual archetypal forces that could be accessed and embodied through proper training and practice. When Toni worked with Jung's patients, she wasn't just providing psychotherapy in any conventional sense. She was teaching them techniques for recognizing and aligning themselves with the archetypal patterns that could restore psychological wholeness and unlock their deepest creative potential. Her methods were essentially modernized versions of the initiation processes once conducted in Egyptian goddess temples. The patients who worked with Toni often experienced transformations that Jung found difficult to explain through his theoretical frameworks. They didn't just resolve their psychological symptoms or achieve better emotional adjustment. They seemed to gain access to sources of wisdom, creativity, and personal power that exceeded anything that conventional therapy could account for. Toni understood something that Jung never fully grasped, that the archetypal forces they were working with weren't just psychological phenomena or symbolic representations. They were actual cosmic principles that could be consciously accessed and directed through techniques that had been preserved through millennia of careful transmission. The influence of Toni's work extended far beyond the field of psychology. The consciousness transformation techniques she developed became the foundation for various forms of personal growth work, spiritual practice, and therapeutic intervention that continue to influence millions of people today. But perhaps most importantly, Toni demonstrated that ancient goddess wisdom could be adapted to address the psychological and spiritual challenges that emerged in the modern world without losing its essential effectiveness. This brings us to one of the most important questions raised by these stories. What would it mean if the consciousness transformation techniques preserved from ancient Egyptian goddess traditions could be fully recovered and openly taught in contemporary society? What possibilities might emerge if women today could access the same sources of power that once made figures like Isis and Hathor so influential and effective? The answer to that question is beginning to emerge through the work of contemporary women who have somehow gained access to these ancient teachings and are finding ways to apply them within current cultural contexts. But their stories also reveal the ongoing challenges and resistances that continue to limit the full expression of authentic feminine spiritual power. Consider the story of Oprah Winfrey, whose transformation from an abused child in rural Mississippi into one of the most influential media figures in history reveals her remarkable mastery of consciousness transformation principles that connect directly to ancient goddess traditions. Oprah's approach to her television work wasn't just about entertainment or information sharing. She learned to create the same kind of consciousness-shifting environment that Egyptian priestesses had once cultivated in their temple gatherings. When people appeared on Oprah's show, they didn't just have conversations or promote their latest projects. They often experienced profound personal transformations that seemed to emerge from their exposure to the particular form of consciousness that Oprah embodied. Guests frequently reported that being in her presence made them feel more connected to their own deepest truths and highest possibilities. Oprah had somehow learned to channel the same archetypal energy that had once been personified as Isis and Hathor. She became a living representation of the divine feminine principle that could nurture, heal, and transform anyone who encountered it with sufficient openness and receptivity. Her influence extended far beyond her television audience to create networks of personal empowerment that operated through the same kind of consciousness transmission that had once spread Egyptian goddess wisdom. The techniques that Oprah used were subtle but remarkably consistent with ancient goddess principles. She learned to align her individual consciousness with what she understood to be universal forces of love, wisdom, and creative potential. When she spoke from these aligned states, people felt as though they were receiving not just personal advice or encouragement, but direct transmission from sources of knowledge that transcended ordinary human understanding. But perhaps most significantly, Oprah demonstrated that these consciousness transformation techniques could be applied through mass media in ways that reached millions of people simultaneously. She showed that the same principles that had once been limited to small groups of temple initiates could be adapted to influence collective consciousness on a scale that would have been impossible in ancient times. The cultural impact of Oprah's work extended throughout American society and beyond, creating what sociologists have called the Oprah effect, a phenomenon where her endorsement or attention could transform unknown individuals into international celebrities, obscure books into bestsellers, and marginal ideas into mainstream cultural movements. This wasn't just the result of her media platform or marketing expertise. Oprah had learned to embody the same reality-shaping power that had once made Egyptian goddesses capable of manifesting their desires in the material world. When she focused her attention on particular people, projects, or possibilities, she was channeling cosmic, creative forces that could literally reshape circumstances and outcomes. The story of how these ancient principles are continuing to evolve and emerge in contemporary culture takes us to one final example that reveals both the incredible potential and the ongoing challenges of trying to resurrect authentic goddess consciousness in the modern world. Elizabeth Gilbert, the author whose book Eat, Pray, Love became a global phenomenon and inspired millions of women to reclaim their own creative and spiritual power, represents a new generation of women who are rediscovering these ancient teachings and finding ways to share them within contemporary cultural contexts. Elizabeth's approach to creativity and personal transformation reveals her deep understanding of principles that would have been immediately recognizable to any priestess of Hathor. She learned to access states of consciousness where individual creative effort became aligned with cosmic creative forces, allowing inspiration and insight to flow through her with remarkable consistency and power. But Elizabeth also discovered something that ancient practitioners had always known: that accessing genuine goddess consciousness requires surrendering conventional ideas about personal control and individual achievement. The creative forces that produced Eat, Pray, Love weren't generated through Elizabeth's personal effort or talent alone. They emerged when she learned to become transparent to archetypal energies that could express themselves through her writing and speaking. The millions of women who were transformed by Elizabeth's work weren't just responding to her personal story or practical advice. They were being activated by their exposure to the same consciousness transformation energy that had once been cultivated through Egyptian goddess worship. They recognized something in Elizabeth's presence and teaching that awakened their own connection to sources of feminine power they had forgotten existed. Elizabeth's influence continues to spread through networks of women who are rediscovering these ancient principles and adapting them to address contemporary challenges, ranging from creative expression to relationship dynamics to professional success. They represent the leading edge of a cultural transformation that could eventually restore the same understanding of feminine spiritual power that once made Egyptian civilization so stable and prosperous. But their work also reveals the ongoing resistance and misunderstanding that continues to limit the full emergence of authentic goddess consciousness in contemporary society. Many people still interpret these teachings through outdated frameworks that reduce them to self-help techniques or New Age spirituality, missing their true significance as sophisticated technologies for accessing and directing cosmic creative forces. The women who are successfully applying these principles in the modern world have learned to work around these limitations by embedding ancient wisdom within contemporary forms that people can accept and understand. They function as bridges between the preserved knowledge of the past and the emerging possibilities of the future, quietly transmitting consciousness transformation techniques that could eventually reshape human civilization in ways that echo the achievements of ancient Egypt. Their stories reveal that the seductive power of goddesses like Isis and Hathor wasn't limited to ancient times or exotic cultural contexts. It represents eternal principles of feminine creative energy that continue to operate whenever women learn to access and embody them with sufficient understanding and skill. The question that remains is whether contemporary culture will develop the wisdom to recognize and support the full expression of these principles, or whether they will continue to operate primarily through hidden networks of women who must disguise their true knowledge to avoid the same kind of persecution that has limited feminine spiritual power throughout most of recorded history. The answer to that question will determine whether humanity can reclaim the same kind of conscious partnership with cosmic creative forces that once made Egyptian civilization a beacon of wisdom and prosperity for the entire ancient world. The teachings of Isis and Hathor remain available to anyone willing to learn them, but their full potential can only be realized when they are supported by cultural contexts that understand their true significance and value. The answer to that question is beginning to unfold in our own time through women who are quietly rediscovering these ancient pathways to power. Often without realizing they're walking in the footsteps of Egyptian priestesses who lived thousands of years ago. But to understand what this means for our future, we need to look at what happened when these principles encountered the digital age and the unprecedented opportunities it created for consciousness transformation on a global scale. Picture Sarah Chen sitting in her small apartment in San Francisco in 2008, recently laid off from her marketing job during the economic crisis. Like millions of other people, Sarah faced an uncertain future with dwindling savings and limited prospects. But unlike most people in her situation, Sarah had been exposed to something that would completely transform her approach to crisis and opportunity. Years earlier, during a college course on comparative religion, Sarah had encountered fragments of Egyptian goddess teachings through a professor who had studied with scholars preserving esoteric traditions. She hadn't thought much about those lessons at the time, but now, facing what seemed like professional and financial ruin, Sarah found herself remembering techniques that the professor had described almost casually during lectures. The professor had mentioned that ancient Egyptian women possessed methods for what she called reality navigation, the ability to perceive and move toward possibilities that others couldn't see. Sarah began experimenting with practices that seemed almost absurdly simple. Spending time each morning in a state of deep receptivity, allowing her consciousness to expand beyond the immediate circumstances that appear to define her situation. During these sessions, Sarah didn't pray for rescue or try to visualize specific outcomes. Instead, she learned to align her awareness with what she began to think of as creative flow, the same principle that Egyptian women had personified as goddess energy. She discovered that when she operated from this aligned state, opportunities and connections seemed to emerge naturally from situations that had previously appeared hopeless. Within weeks, Sarah began noticing possibilities that hadn't been visible before. She realized that the economic crisis creating so much fear and uncertainty was also generating demand for new forms of support and guidance. People were desperately seeking ways to navigate unprecedented challenges, and many traditional institutions were failing to provide adequate help. Sarah understood something that connected her directly to the ancient goddess tradition, that periods of apparent chaos and breakdown were actually moments of greatest creative potential. Like Isis transforming the death of Osiris into the birth of new life, Sarah recognized that her personal crisis was an invitation to access forms of power and capability she had never needed before. Instead of seeking another conventional job, Sarah began creating what would eventually become one of the most successful online platforms for personal transformation and consciousness development. But she didn't approach this project as a typical business venture. Sarah had learned to embody the same principle that had made Hathor so influential. The understanding that true success comes from creating joy and beauty that others find irresistibly attractive. The content that Sarah produced wasn't based on academic theories or borrowed wisdom from established experts. She had learned to access the same direct knowing that had once guided Egyptian priestesses in their work with individuals seeking healing and empowerment. When Sarah created videos, wrote articles, or designed courses, she was channeling insights that emerged from her alignment with cosmic creative intelligence. The response to Sarah's work was extraordinary. People who encountered her content reported experiencing shifts in consciousness that seemed to unlock capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Women particularly responded to something in Sarah's presence that awakened their own connection to sources of feminine power they had been taught to ignore or suppress. But Sarah's influence went far beyond helping individuals achieve personal breakthroughs. She had somehow learned to create what Egyptian priestesses would have recognized as group consciousness fields, environments where multiple people could access enhanced states of awareness simultaneously through their shared participation in her programs and communities. The online gatherings that Sarah facilitated weren't just educational events or support groups. They became modern versions of the temple ceremonies where ancient women had learned to channel goddess energy collectively. Participants reported that being part of these virtual communities made them feel more creative, confident, and capable of manifesting positive changes in their own lives. Within 5 years, Sarah's platform was reaching millions of people worldwide, generating revenue that exceeded what most traditional corporations achieved, and creating networks of empowered individuals who were applying consciousness transformation techniques in fields ranging from business and relationships to health and artistic expression. But perhaps most significantly, Sarah had demonstrated something that revealed the true potential of ancient goddess principles in the digital age. The same consciousness transformation techniques that had once been limited to small groups of temple initiates could now be transmitted to global audiences through technologies that amplified rather than diminished their effectiveness. Sarah's success inspired other women who had somehow gained access to similar knowledge and were finding their own ways to apply it within contemporary contexts. Consider the story of Maria Gonzalez, a former investment banker who had burned out from years of working in environments that demanded she suppress her intuitive capabilities and feminine approach to problem solving. Maria's transformation began when she attended one of Sarah's online programs and experienced something that reminded her of feelings she had known as a child, but had learned to dismiss as impractical fantasies. During the program, Maria found herself accessing states of awareness where complex financial patterns became as clear and predictable as weather systems to someone who understood atmospheric dynamics. Maria realized that the analytical skills that had made her successful in traditional finance were actually just one aspect of a much more comprehensive form of intelligence that could perceive relationships and possibilities that purely logical thinking would never reveal. She had stumbled upon the same integration of rational analysis and intuitive knowing that had made Egyptian women such effective administrators and advisors. Rather than returning to her previous career, Maria began applying these enhanced capabilities to helping other women create financial independence through approaches that honored both practical effectiveness and feminine wisdom principles. She understood something that most financial advisors never learned: that sustainable prosperity must be aligned with cosmic creative forces rather than based on manipulation or exploitation of others. The techniques that Maria taught weren't just about investment strategies or business development. She had learned to help women align their relationship with money and resources with the same principles that had once been embodied by goddesses like Hathor, who governed abundance and prosperity through joy and creative expression rather than through domination and scarcity. Women who worked with Maria often experienced transformations that extended far beyond their financial circumstances. They learned to embody the same confidence and magnetic presence that had made ancient Egyptian women so influential in their communities. They discovered that when their relationship with resources was aligned with goddess principles, opportunities and support seemed to flow toward them naturally. Maria's influence spread through networks of women who were applying these consciousness transformation techniques to challenges ranging from career development and creative expression to relationship dynamics and family healing. They represented a growing movement of individuals who were rediscovering ancient wisdom and adapting it to address contemporary problems that conventional approaches had failed to solve. But the story that most clearly reveals the potential scope of how these principles could transform modern society involves a woman whose work is reshaping how entire organizations understand leadership, creativity, and collective effectiveness. Dr. Amanda Rivers had spent decades studying organizational psychology and witnessing the failure of traditional management approaches to create genuinely productive and fulfilling work environments. Amanda's breakthrough came when she began experimenting with consciousness transformation techniques that she had learned through her study of ancient wisdom traditions. She discovered that the same principles that had once guided Egyptian priestesses in their temple administration could be applied to modern organizational challenges with remarkable results. Amanda understood something that most business consultants and management experts had never considered: that the effectiveness of any group or organization was fundamentally determined by the quality of consciousness that its leaders embodied and transmitted to others. She had learned to create what ancient women would have recognized as coherent group consciousness fields, where individual capabilities could be enhanced and coordinated through collective alignment with creative cosmic forces. The companies that worked with Amanda experienced transformations that seemed almost miraculous from conventional business perspectives. Employee engagement and productivity increased dramatically, creative innovation accelerated, conflict and competition were replaced by collaboration and mutual support. Financial performance improved while stress and burnout decreased. But Amanda's methods weren't based on new management techniques or organizational restructuring. She had learned to teach leaders how to embody the same consciousness transformation principles that had once been associated with goddess worship. When executives and managers learned to align their individual awareness with cosmic creative intelligence, their presence naturally inspired others to access their own highest capabilities. Amanda's work revealed something profound about the potential applications of ancient Egyptian goddess wisdom in contemporary contexts. The same techniques that had once been used to maintain harmony and prosperity in temple communities could be adapted to transform any form of collective human endeavor, from business organizations and educational institutions to families and communities. The leaders who mastered Amanda's teachings didn't just become more effective at achieving conventional goals. They learned to embody the same reality-shaping presence that had made figures like Cleopatra and Hatshepsut so influential. They discovered that when their leadership was aligned with goddess principles, they could create organizational cultures where everyone involved experienced greater fulfillment, creativity, and success. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Amanda's work was her recognition that these consciousness transformation techniques weren't just tools for improving existing systems. They were methods for accessing the same creative intelligence that had once guided the development of Egyptian civilization itself, the most stable and prosperous society in ancient history. Amanda began teaching her most advanced students to envision and manifest entirely new forms of social organization that could integrate the technological capabilities of the modern world with the wisdom principles that had made ancient Egypt so successful. She understood that humanity was facing challenges that could only be addressed through conscious collaboration with the same cosmic creative forces that Egyptian women had learned to channel through their goddess practices. The students who mastered Amanda's advanced teachings began creating experimental communities and organizations that operated according to principles that would have been immediately recognizable to any priestess of Isis or Hathor. These weren't utopian communes or spiritual retreats separated from practical reality. They were functioning examples of how ancient wisdom could be applied to create forms of collective life that were more sustainable, fulfilling, and effective than anything that conventional approaches had achieved. Consider the story of the community that emerged around Jessica Park, a former Silicon Valley executive who had learned Amanda's techniques and applied them to creating what she called a consciousness-based, intentional community. Jessica understood that the same principles that could transform individual lives and business organizations could be scaled up to reshape entire ways of living and relating. The community that Jessica founded wasn't based on shared ideology or common interests in any conventional sense. Instead, it was organized around collective commitment to embodying the consciousness transformation principles that had once been cultivated through Egyptian goddess worship. Members learned to align their individual awareness with cosmic creative forces and to coordinate their activities through the same kind of group consciousness fields that had once been generated in ancient temple gatherings. The results were extraordinary. The community achieved levels of material prosperity, creative productivity, and interpersonal harmony that exceeded anything that conventional communities had accomplished. Members reported experiencing greater personal fulfillment, enhanced capabilities, and deeper relationships than they had known in traditional social contexts. But perhaps most significantly, Jessica's community became a demonstration site where visitors could experience directly how ancient goddess principles could be applied to address contemporary challenges. People who spent time there often returned to their own communities with new understanding of possibilities that they had never imagined before. The influence of Jessica's experiment spread through networks of individuals who were applying similar principles in contexts ranging from alternative education and ecological restoration to artistic collaboration and technological innovation. They represented the leading edge of a cultural transformation that could eventually restore the same conscious partnership with cosmic creative forces that had made Egyptian civilization so remarkable. But their work also revealed the ongoing challenges and resistances that continue to limit the full emergence of authentic goddess consciousness in contemporary society. Many people who encountered these teachings were still interpreting them through frameworks that reduced them to personal development techniques or lifestyle choices, missing their true significance as methods for accessing and directing fundamental creative forces. The women and men who were successfully applying these principles had learned to work around these limitations by demonstrating their effectiveness through practical results rather than through theoretical explanations. They functioned as living examples of what became possible when human consciousness was aligned with the same cosmic principles that Egyptian women had personified as goddesses. Their stories revealed that the seductive power attributed to figures like Isis and Hathor wasn't based on supernatural abilities or ancient cultural conditions that no longer applied. It represented eternal aspects of consciousness that could be accessed and embodied by anyone willing to learn the necessary techniques and commit to the required practice. But the full potential of these teachings could only be realized when they were supported by cultural contexts that understood their true value and significance. The question that emerged from all these contemporary examples was whether modern civilization would develop the wisdom to recognize and nurture the full expression of consciousness transformation principles, or whether they would continue to operate primarily through hidden networks of individuals who had to disguise their true knowledge to avoid misunderstanding and resistance. The answer to that question was beginning to emerge through a new generation of young women who were growing up with access to both ancient wisdom and modern technological capabilities. These young women represented something unprecedented in human history: the possibility of conscious collaboration between timeless spiritual principles and contemporary tools for global communication and influence. Consider the story of Zara Williams, a 22-year-old woman who had been exposed to consciousness transformation techniques through her mother's involvement with one of the communities that had emerged from Amanda's work. Unlike previous generations of women who had to rediscover these teachings through difficult personal crises or accidental encounters with preserved traditions, Zara had been raised with direct understanding of how to access and apply goddess consciousness principles. Zara's approach to her life and work revealed her natural mastery of techniques that previous generations had spent decades learning. She moved through the world with the same confident presence that ancient Egyptian women had cultivated through years of temple training. She understood intuitively how to align her individual consciousness with cosmic creative forces and how to create environments where others could access enhanced states of awareness. But Zara also possessed something that no previous generation of women had ever had: the ability to transmit consciousness transformation energy through digital technologies that could reach global audiences instantaneously. She had learned to create online content and virtual experiences that functioned as modern versions of ancient goddess temple ceremonies. The platform that Zara created combined the most advanced digital technologies with the most sophisticated consciousness transformation techniques, preserved from ancient wisdom traditions. People who participated in her virtual gatherings reported experiencing the same kinds of profound shifts in awareness and capability that had once been available only to temple initiates who spent years in direct training with Egyptian priestesses. But Zara's influence extended far beyond helping individuals achieve personal breakthroughs. She had learned to create what could only be described as global consciousness fields, virtual environments where millions of people could participate simultaneously in collective consciousness transformation processes that were scaled-up versions of ancient group rituals. The cultural impact of Zara's work was unprecedented. Within months of launching her platform, she was influencing the consciousness of individuals in every country on Earth. People who had never heard of ancient Egyptian goddess traditions were experiencing activation of the same archetypal energies that had once been personified as Isis and Hathor. But perhaps most remarkably, Zara had demonstrated that the consciousness transformation techniques, preserved from ancient wisdom traditions, could be integrated with contemporary technologies in ways that amplified rather than diminished their effectiveness. She had created a bridge between the timeless principles that had guided human development for millennia and the emerging possibilities of a globally connected civilization. Zara's success inspired other young women who were combining ancient wisdom with modern capabilities to create forms of influence and impact that exceeded anything that previous generations had imagined possible. They represented the emergence of what could be called a global goddess consciousness movement. Though most participants wouldn't have described their work in those terms, these young women understood something that connected them directly to their ancient predecessors. That feminine creative power wasn't limited by conventional boundaries or traditional limitations. They had learned to embody the same reality-shaping presence that had made figures like Isis and Hathor so influential. But they were applying it within contexts and through methods that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. The transformation that was beginning to emerge through their work suggested possibilities that were almost too extraordinary to believe. If consciousness transformation techniques that had once been limited to small groups of temple initiates could now be transmitted to global audiences through digital technologies, what might become possible if millions of people learn to access and apply these principles simultaneously? The answer to that question was beginning to unfold through experimental projects that were combining ancient wisdom with emerging technologies in ways that could revolutionize human civilization itself. Consider the story of the Global Consciousness Coordination Project that emerged from collaboration between women like Zara and advanced researchers who were studying the intersection of consciousness, technology, and collective human potential. The project was based on a simple but revolutionary premise that the same consciousness transformation techniques that had once guided the development of ancient Egyptian civilization could be applied on a global scale through digital platforms that allowed millions of people to participate in coordinated consciousness alignment processes. The initial experiments were modest, but produced results that exceeded all expectations. When groups of people who had learned basic goddess consciousness principles, participated in synchronized meditation and visualization practices through global digital networks. They seemed to generate collective fields of awareness that could influence events and circumstances far beyond what individual participants could have achieved alone. The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptian women had been able to maintain the stability and prosperity of their civilization through conscious collaboration with cosmic creative forces, what might become possible if contemporary humanity learned to apply the same principles on a planetary scale? The question was no longer whether the consciousness transformation techniques preserved from ancient goddess traditions could be recovered and applied in the modern world. The question was whether humanity would develop the wisdom and courage to embrace their full potential before the challenges facing contemporary civilization became insurmountable. The women who were leading this emerging transformation understood that they were participating in something far more significant than personal development or spiritual awakening. They were midwifing the birth of a new phase of human consciousness that could integrate the technological capabilities of the modern world with the wisdom principles that had guided the most successful civilizations in human history. But they also understood that this transformation required more than just teaching consciousness techniques or creating new technologies. It required the same kind of complete commitment to embodying divine feminine principles that had once characterized the most advanced Egyptian priestesses. The women who were successfully applying these teachings in contemporary contexts had learned to see themselves not just as individuals seeking personal empowerment, but as conscious participants in the evolution of human consciousness itself. They understood that their work was continuing the same mission that had once motivated women like Isis and Hathor, creating conditions where human beings could access and express their highest creative potential through conscious collaboration with cosmic forces. The stories of Sarah, Maria, Amanda, Jessica, and Zara represented just the beginning of what was possible when ancient goddess wisdom was combined with contemporary capabilities and global reach. They had demonstrated that the seductive power attributed to Egyptian goddesses wasn't just historical curiosity or mythological fantasy. It was accessible reality that could transform individual lives, communities, organizations, and potentially entire civilizations. But the full flowering of this potential required something that had always been essential to goddess consciousness: the recognition that true power comes not from dominating others or manipulating circumstances, but from aligning individual will with cosmic creative intelligence and allowing that alignment to attract and manifest whatever serves the highest good of all life. The women who were mastering these principles in the contemporary world were learning the same lesson that had guided their ancient predecessors: that the most seductive quality anyone could possess was complete authenticity to their own divine nature, expressed through joyful service to the creative evolution of consciousness itself. This understanding was beginning to spread through networks of women and men who recognized that the challenges facing contemporary humanity could only be addressed through conscious collaboration with the same creative forces that had once been personified as Egyptian goddesses. They were discovering that the ancient wisdom wasn't obsolete knowledge from humanity's primitive past, but sophisticated technology for accessing forms of intelligence and capability that modern civilization desperately needed to recover. The question that remained was whether this rediscovery of goddess consciousness principles would emerge quickly enough and spread widely enough to guide humanity through the transition that lay ahead. The answer depended on whether enough people could learn to embody the same courage, wisdom, and dedication that had once made women like Isis and Hathor such powerful forces for transformation and renewal. The seeds of that transformation were already planted and beginning to sprout in communities around the world. The ancient goddess consciousness was awakening within contemporary women who were finding ways to express it through modern contexts and technologies. The same creative intelligence that had once guided the development of Egyptian civilization was becoming available to guide the evolution of global human consciousness. But like any birth process, this emergence required patience, skill, and unwavering commitment to the vision of what was possible. The women who were leading this transformation understood that they were participating in something far more significant than any individual achievement or personal success. They were midwifing the return of divine feminine wisdom to a world that had forgotten how much it needed the consciousness transformation principles that goddesses like Isis and Hathor had always represented. The seduction they embodied wasn't manipulation or artificial attraction. It was the irresistible appeal of authentic creative power expressing itself through human consciousness that had learned to align completely with cosmic evolutionary intelligence. It was the same magnetism that had always drawn people toward anyone who had mastered the art of conscious collaboration with the forces that create and sustain all life. And that magnetism was beginning to spread through networks of awakening individuals who were rediscovering what it meant to live as conscious expressions of divine creative principle, just as their ancient Egyptian predecessors had done thousands of years ago in temples that were really schools for learning to embody the consciousness of the goddesses themselves. The transformation that was beginning to emerge through their work suggested something that would have been immediately familiar to the ancient priestesses of Memphis and Thebes: that divine feminine power operates through attraction rather than force, through inspiration rather than domination, and through the creation of possibilities so compelling that people naturally gravitate toward them. This principle was being rediscovered by women who had learned to access the same consciousness-shaping techniques that had once made Egyptian goddesses irresistible to gods and mortals alike. But now these ancient methods were being applied within contexts that their original practitioners could never have imagined. Consider what was happening in boardrooms across Silicon Valley, where executives who had spent their careers focused solely on profit maximization were beginning to encounter something that challenged their entire understanding of how business success was created. The story of Rebecca Martinez illustrates how profoundly these ancient principles could transform even the most conventional corporate environments. Rebecca had risen through the ranks of a major technology company by demonstrating exceptional analytical skills and strategic thinking. But despite her professional success, she found herself increasingly frustrated by the competitive, fear-based culture that dominated her industry. The constant pressure to outmaneuver rivals and exploit market advantages felt increasingly hollow and unsustainable. Everything changed when Rebecca attended a leadership retreat where she encountered teachings that connected directly to the consciousness transformation principles that had once been cultivated in Egyptian goddess temples. The facilitator didn't present these ideas as ancient wisdom or spiritual practices. Instead, she described them as advanced techniques for accessing and directing creative intelligence that could revolutionize how organizations functioned. Rebecca learned that the same awareness that had allowed Isis to perceive solutions to seemingly impossible problems could be cultivated by contemporary leaders who were willing to move beyond purely logical analysis. She discovered that when her individual consciousness was aligned with what she began to think of as cosmic creative flow, she could perceive patterns and possibilities that conventional strategic thinking would never reveal. The transformation in Rebecca's leadership style was immediate and dramatic. Instead of trying to force outcomes through aggressive tactics or manipulative strategies, she learned to create environments where the best solutions could emerge naturally through collaborative intelligence. She embodied the same principle that had made Hathor so effective at resolving conflicts: the understanding that joy and beauty were more powerful than fear and domination. The teams that worked under Rebecca's leadership began producing results that exceeded anything they had achieved through traditional management approaches. Innovation accelerated, employee satisfaction increased, customer loyalty deepened. Financial performance improved while stress and burnout decreased throughout her division. But most remarkably, Rebecca discovered that when she operated from goddess-aligned consciousness, She became irresistibly attractive to exactly the kinds of opportunities and partnerships that her company needed most. Joint ventures that had seemed impossible suddenly became feasible. Investors who had been reluctant to commit found themselves eager to participate. Talented individuals who could have worked anywhere chose to join her teams. Rebecca's success attracted attention from other executives who wanted to understand how she was achieving such extraordinary results. But when they tried to copy her methods without understanding the consciousness principles that made them effective, their efforts produced mediocre outcomes at best. The secret wasn't in Rebecca's techniques or strategies. It was in her embodiment of the same reality-shaping presence that had made ancient Egyptian women so influential in their communities. She had learned to operate as a conscious channel for creative intelligence that exceeded anything her individual mind could have generated alone. This pattern was being repeated by women in fields ranging from medicine and education to the arts and social activism. They were discovering that when they learned to align their professional activities with consciousness transformation principles preserved from ancient goddess traditions, they could achieve outcomes that seemed almost miraculous from conventional perspectives. Dr. Elena Vasquez's story illustrates how these principles were being applied within healthcare settings, where traditional approaches had reached the limits of their effectiveness. Elena had spent 15 years as an emergency room physician, witnessing daily the human suffering that resulted from medical systems focused primarily on treating symptoms, rather than addressing underlying causes of illness and dysfunction. Elena's transformation began when she started experimenting with consciousness techniques that she had learned through her study of ancient healing traditions. She discovered that the same awareness that had allowed Egyptian priestesses to channel healing energy through their presence and intention could be cultivated by contemporary medical practitioners willing to expand beyond purely mechanical approaches to healthcare. Elena learned that when she entered states of consciousness aligned with what ancient women would have recognized as Isis energy, she could perceive aspects of her patient's conditions that conventional diagnostic methods would never detect. She began to understand illness and healing as expressions of consciousness patterns that could be transformed through the same principles that had once guided temple healing practices. The changes in Elena's medical practice were extraordinary. Patients who had been labeled as hopeless cases began experiencing recoveries that her colleagues found difficult to explain. Chronic conditions that had resisted years of conventional treatment started resolving through approaches that integrated consciousness transformation with traditional medical interventions. But perhaps most significantly, Elena discovered that when she embodied genuine healing consciousness, she became a catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond her individual patients. Other healthcare providers who worked with her began accessing their own enhanced capabilities. Hospital environments where she practiced became more harmonious and effective. Families of patients experienced their own healing processes through exposure to the consciousness field that Elena had learned to generate. Elena understood something that connected her directly to the ancient tradition: that true healing wasn't just about fixing problems or eliminating symptoms. It was about creating conditions where the natural creative intelligence of life itself could restore balance and wholeness through its own perfect wisdom. The techniques that Elena developed began spreading through networks of healthcare providers who recognized that these consciousness-based approaches could address aspects of healing that purely technological medicine could never reach. They represented a quiet revolution that was transforming healthcare from the inside, one practitioner at a time. Meanwhile, in educational settings around the world, teachers were discovering that the same principles could revolutionize how learning and development occurred. The story of Michael Chen illustrates how even male educators could access and apply these consciousness transformation techniques when they approached them with proper understanding and respect. Michael had spent 20 years as a high school mathematics teacher, becoming increasingly frustrated by his students' resistance to learning and their apparent inability to grasp concepts that he found obvious and elegant. Traditional teaching methods seemed to create more confusion than clarity, and disciplinary problems were consuming more and more of his energy and attention. Michael's breakthrough came when he encountered teachings about consciousness alignment that had been adapted from ancient wisdom traditions for contemporary educational applications. He learned that the same awareness that had allowed Egyptian women to transmit knowledge and wisdom to temple initiates could be cultivated by modern educators who were willing to move beyond purely intellectual approaches to learning. Michael discovered that when he aligned his consciousness with cosmic creative intelligence before entering his classroom, he could somehow transmit understanding directly to his students through his presence and intention. Mathematical concepts that had previously seemed abstract and difficult became clear and accessible when presented from states of consciousness that were aligned with universal principles of harmony and order. The transformation in Michael's classroom was remarkable. Students who had been struggling with basic mathematical concepts suddenly began grasping advanced principles. Behavioral problems virtually disappeared as students became genuinely engaged with learning processes that felt meaningful and enjoyable. Test scores improved dramatically, while stress and anxiety decreased for both students and teacher. But most importantly, Michael's students began demonstrating the same kind of enhanced learning capabilities in their other classes and activities. They had been activated by exposure to consciousness states that accelerated their natural intelligence and creativity. The effects spread throughout the school, as other teachers began noticing improvements in students who had spent time in Michael's classes. Michael understood that he wasn't just teaching mathematics. He was helping young people access and develop their own capacity for conscious collaboration with creative intelligence. He was preparing them to participate in the same kind of reality-shaping work that had once been the province of trained temple initiates. The success of educators like Michael was contributing to a quiet transformation of educational systems that were beginning to recognize the importance of consciousness development alongside conventional academic learning. They were rediscovering something that ancient civilizations had always known: that true education must address the whole human being, not just intellectual capabilities. Through the stories we've explored today, from Ankhesenamun's desperate gambit to save her throne to the contemporary women rediscovering these ancient pathways, we've witnessed the timeless power of Isis and Hathor's teachings. These goddesses offered something revolutionary: the understanding that feminine creative energy wasn't just about fertility or seduction, but about accessing the very forces that shape reality itself. Their legacy lives on in every woman who learns to align her consciousness with cosmic creative intelligence, proving that the most irresistible power has always been the authentic expression of divine feminine wisdom in service to life's endless potential.